So now that we have a better understanding of what happens to women on birth control and what happens to women off birth control, we can kind of dive into what happened to the large mass of women that we had in the United States around the time that it really took off. So what sort of changes happened? Well, first of all, they're not getting married as young. Relationships are not as high priority anymore because, well, there's no longer a necessity to get right into that. If you want to go out and you want to have a relationship, which could possibly lead to sexual interactions, you no longer need to have that institution of marriage behind you, because for the most part, you're safe in believing that you're not going to have kids. So you could go out and, find the guy down at the bar, or find the guy that you work with, or whoever, someone that your family introduces you to or whatever, and you can just go out and date with him. And you can strike up more intimate types of relationships without worrying about jumping into something more serious, because the likelihood of you producing a child is not that great. And so when you're young, your mind can sort of focus on more things that are especially career related and non-relationship goal oriented. So for example, once birth control was made available to unmarried women, somewhere around the 60s and 70s, more women were featured in things like law school, medical school, and business school, things of that nature. More women are going out and getting bachelor's degrees in all sorts of subjects. More women are going out and getting master's degrees in all sorts of subjects, and they're sort of getting into more male-dominated career areas and climbing up the proverbial ladder to see just how high they can get. So what kind of happens right after this is not only historically evident, but I think we can kind of see it coming. As a result, women and their employers felt more confident in their abilities to complete a long-term goal, such as education or employment. Because if you're going out and you're getting more prestigious degrees and you're proving yourself to employers that are looking for people to fill highly paid positions or highly sought after positions, and they see that you're able to do the same types of things that men are, then you show a level of confidence and skill and wherewithal to complete difficult tasks that originally weren't attached to women as a whole. And also in education, because if you're climbing up the ranks and there's more women that are coming into education, then these large institutions are going to feel more comfortable bringing them in because it's proof of concept. It also gave women the ability to plan. So after birth control happened, progesterone-based synthetic birth control, after that type of birth control happened and became easily accessible to women, they could now make more serious goals that they wanted to achieve for their life. So now that you don't run a risk of meeting somebody and having an intimate relationship, having kids prior to marriage, prior to setting up a certain foundation, instead of giving your life over to that and you can go after your career, well, now you can think, oh, well, since I don't have to worry about the likelihood of me having kids, I can plan, I'm going to go to school for this long. I'm going to have this job for this long. And then I'm going to move into this area and I'm going to buy this house and I can live on my own because now I don't need a man to do that. I've got my own money. I've got my own credentials. And I can have relationships any way that I want to because there's no risk of me having to be attached to that person. So women start achieving more, but at the same time, men start floundering. And we see this decrease in things like testosterone. We see this decrease in male drive, and just the young men that we have are not achieving the same things that they used to. Now, you might not see a direct connection between those two, but I kind of want to give you something a little bit to think about. So as I said, men's testosterone levels have kind of been declining, and I believe there's a statistic that says that they've decreased 1% per year since 1980. Although you could liken this to other factors. So, you could think about like the plastics that we have and the pollution that we have in our air, and there's like, chemicals that we put in the water, various things that could affect these hormones levels. But in a lot of these studies where you even control for those variables, there's something missing in the data that's still directly related to this drop in testosterone. So here's something interesting I want you to think about. Dave Asbury had an interesting question. He noted that in most mammalian species, if you simply allow the males to be in the presence of a female that's regularly cycling and regularly putting off hormones that, in almost like a pheromone nature, gives off the impression that these are fertile women, it increases the testosterone of those male species. There's a really good study that's done on red deer that show this exact thing, that when mating season is not happening and the women are not in heat, when the female species are not in that part of their cycle that makes them fertile, a lot of the young bucks, they haven't grown antlers yet. They are very docile. They're kind of running around playing with the other bucks. And then as soon as these female deer go into heat, it's like, boom, there it is. And they start fighting with each other. They grow antlers. They get very aggressive. They sort of form this dominance hierarchy where it's like, I'm going to have all the women and you're not going to have any of them, which is a whole nother discussion. We could get into how there's some similarities between that and our species that's played out in recent years. But so even without telling a man that a woman is fertile, they kind of know. And to give you an example of where this is demonstrated, there was a study where they took a series of women, both on birth control and off birth control, and they were regularly cycling. And they had them do some simple tasks. So like one example would be they would have to walk, or they would have to stand, or like just certain things that really are only indicators visually. And by and large, once you go through all the data and sort into the categories, the men were most attracted to the women that were not on birth control and they were going through a regular cycle, especially in the part of their cycle that high estradiol was seen. So when they're most fertile, men kind of pick up on this not only by virtue of, say pheromones, they also pick up on this by the way that the woman walks, or the way that the woman holds herself, or these types of things. So that's something interesting to note. And going back to sort of the social ramifications of what birth control did and how it changed the way that women did things in society. If you no longer need to worry about the likelihood of having children, and you can have sort of more casual relationships, or what later on becomes the start of this hookup culture, it changes the bar that men have to rise to in order to have intimate relationships with a female. So what I mean by that is, if you take pre-synthetic progesterone, birth control days, there was sort of a norm for courtship, for marriage, for that sort of thing. So as a man, you would have to, not only be attractive, you not only have to, show that you could be a provider, show that you're stable, so that, you're mentally stable as well as financially. You'd also have to do things like getting to know the girl's parents or her family or her household. You'd have to get to know the father. You'd have to ask the father for a blessing. You would have to go through this checklist of things in order to have any chance at being, sexually active with this woman. Which for, some, I don't want to say that's the goal of marriage per se, but certainly it's one of the aspects that's very, pleasing when it comes to marriage. And so as the bar for those things rose, or I guess rather you could say fell lower and lower, men no longer had to do those things to be able to have intimate relationships. So men will rise to whatever bar permits them the sexual access. And as women on birth control have plunged said bar lower and lower, men have lessened their requirements to themselves or the requirements of themselves in order to be a viable sexual partner. And so what it not only did was change the way that women did things in sort of a more romantic social context, it changed the way that men did things, and thus begets hookup culture. So what we see after that is a complete shift in the way that relationships are had. Once the pill comes out, once the sexual revolution comes out, once these two things sort of converge and change the culture of dating, you have more things like polyamory and polygamy and relationships of that sort. And it gets to the extreme where men and women swap their traditional roles. So, for example, you have this image of stay-at-home dad, stay-at-home husband, does all the housework, does all the cleaning, does all the nurturing, where the wife, girlfriend, whatever, goes out and, becomes the primary breadwinner of that household and does a lot of, like the more financially profound things which impact that household. And something that's kind of, I guess, strange, but makes more sense once you think about it, that's a result of this, is that by and large, women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence if they are the primary breadwinners of a family versus the opposite. And you also see this decline in marriage rates as the connection between marriage and having children gets broken, and they're no longer seen as the same thing. When your marriage rates start to decline, you get more single-parent homes. You get more homes where, there's a lot of single moms primarily. I don't guess you could really say there's as many single dads as single moms. Part of that's just related to the way that the justice system handles these custodial battles, and that's something you could get into later on. But there's also a decrease in teen out-of-wedlock childbirthing, which is kind of fascinating. I think maybe, part of that you could connect to the rise in teenagers getting on birth control at such a young age, oddly enough, for the same types of menstrual problems that came in waves back in the late 60s or whatever, when women were buying birth control for its side effect. I know personally the vast majority of the girls that I went to high school with, that I went to middle school with, whenever they started to go through puberty and those sorts of things, were on birth control from a fairly young age. It was almost kind of like just the thing to do. It's kind of like, you reach a certain age, and if you're a girl, you go pierce your ears. Or if you reach a certain age, you go and maybe get a dress for prom or that sort of thing. And it kind of seemed like there was a culture, at least in the school that I went to, where birth control was, it certainly wasn't talked about. But if you were able to talk to any woman, individually, that's kind of like you apply that to every woman that you talk to, and you form the culture of that sort of group. And it seems like, getting on birth control is something that's synonymous. Well, not necessarily synonymous with, but similar in capacity to, say, like getting your ears pierced or something like that. So, oddly enough, you would expect that there would be almost an increase in childbirthing as marriage becomes less important, and you can go out and you can have kids without necessarily having to have a marriage. But it doesn't. And it's kind of an indicator of the decoupling between child-rearing and marriage. So this gets into sort of the second major part of this discussion, which is, what do those declining rates of marriage in our country result in?